Oh, hey, well, welcome back, AP. Now, I can't shout or scream or clap or be really, really loud because it's currently 5:45 in the morning. All right, welcome to it. That's right, we're talking in the early. The sun's still not even out at my house, which is really, really creepy and disgusting. But the biggest thing is I had to get up early because I had this teaching conference today and stuff like that. But I wanted to get this up in a timely manner so you can maybe start this like right when you get home from school, right? Now, the thing about it is though, is we are going to pick up right where we left off in class, and we're going to actually pick up on this super confusing topic, okay? So I understand that the Russian Revolution that's happening all up in the middle of World War I can be something that's kind of intimidating and kind of ridiculous. But hey, at least at least a lot of y'all got a kick out of the Rasputin story, right? I know like Como, Dakota really liked the Rasputin story. I saw Kayla really liked the Rasputin story. And of course, Jordan, remember, you don't have to change him. He's dead. And then of course, like Abigail Winningham is probably going to be starting that fan page account in the pickle costume any minute now. Now, the biggest thing about it in the long run is that we left off talking about in class the basically following the the February Revolution, International Women's Day. Military is told to shoot crowd. Military refuses. Nicholas is going to abdicate. He's going to be arrested. And what's going on is you're now being led by the provisional government, right? So the provisional government is then, of course, going to have a rival government that pops up known as the Petrograd Soviet. The Petrograd Soviet is going to be dismantling the government basically from within, in a sense, where they're going to basically have this parallel government, this secret parallel government that's going to do things like encourage guys to desert the army with Army Order Number 1 and try to weaken the provisional government's ability to rule. Now, the big thing about the Petrograd Soviet, though, is that it did have two groups inside of it, okay? The Petrograd Soviet, of course, trying to fight the provisional government, had two groups inside of it, known as the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, right? Now, the Bolsheviks, which that word in Russian means majority, they're hardline, violent communists, okay? And then there's the Mensheviks. That word means minority. They're reform-minded communists or socialists, right? Now, funny enough, too, something important that you probably need to understand is that nobody is calling themselves communist yet. They're still calling themselves Labor Socialist Democratic Party, right? They're still calling themselves socialists. Now, eventually, Lenin is going to stop calling himself a socialist, and he's going to begin to call himself a communist. But for now, he's just calling himself a Bolshevik socialist, and then there's the Menshevik socialist. Now, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks do represent that split in the dichotomy of socialist and Marxist thought during the late 1800s. The Bolsheviks believe a violent uprising is going to be the only way to change the government and the only way to lead Russia, and the Mensheviks believe that reform-minded socialist moves, voting, and different kinds of ideas of using democratic process is going to be the way to actually help and fix the government of Russia, right? Well, two of our guys that are very important, that are Bolshevik leaders, were, of course, Vladimir Lenin and then Leon Trotsky, right? So, like, Leon Trotsky was the guy that we got introduced to yesterday. He is a socialist thinker and a very intense one at that, but he's very, very eloquent. He's a very good writer. He's a very, very good at like actually writing speeches that Vladimir Lenin would get up on these big pulpits and he would give these intense speeches where he would just be shouting at the crowd and be talking about bringing back the glory of Russia and like all these other things and trying to make a socialist-minded idea and to make a working man's Russia, right? Now, this is going to galvanize a lot of supporters, and Leon Trotsky is also going to begin to start leading a very important group. Write these people down. They're known as the Red Guard, right? The Red Guard is the military group, basically paramilitary group that Leon Trotsky is going to start leading for Vladimir Lenin. They're basically a very large militia that is willing to actually fight for the Bolsheviks when they need to. Now, they're going to use their influence, though, Leon Trotsky and Vladimir Lenin, to infiltrate the Petrograd Soviet and begin to expand their membership. They're going to begin to go around, and Vladimir Lenin is going to be preaching this very, very important concept of the idea that he wants to try and make it so like this socialist government is not led completely by the people, but that it's led by a cadre of elite individuals who can read and they're right and that are formally educated and stuff like that. Don't you love to learn about the Russian Revolution? You just licked it directly into my mouth. You are so gross. Now, anyway, but the big thing about it, though, is these people all believe in violence alone, using that Red Guard to overthrow the government directly. But at first, they tried to do it in a somewhat peaceful manner. The Red Guard shows up in the streets, but the Russian military the provisional government are going to successfully disband them and stop some of their earliest attempts. In this process, which is really, really weird, Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky are actually going to be exiled to Finland for a small amount of time during this entire crazy thing that's going on. But what ends up happening is that guy, Alexander Kerensky, who's leading the provisional government at this point, is being threatened by another military that apparently is coming up from the south. And so he is forced to bring Lenin and Trotsky back from Finland because Lenin and Trotsky have the Red Guard. And Kerensky's like, dude, if you just use your Red Guard to help me out, I'd really, really appreciate it. They come back from Finland. They prevent this like other military from invading. And if you want to learn a little bit more about this, you can like jump down to the description. There's a really, really good video on the Russian Revolution that you can like check out. But in the long run, what ends up happening, they come back from Finland, they destroy a bunch of infrastructure, they save Kerensky, but then Kerensky and Vladimir Lenin end up having a falling out because Vladimir Lenin is furious that the provisional government is not getting anything done. He said that they are a squabbling group of idiots that basically all they want to do is argue about what's better. Anarchism, democratic socialism, democracy, liberalism, conservatism, because that was the problem with the provisional government. It was said so many groups inside of it that they could never get anything done, right? They could never get anything done. They would always just argue and argue and argue, so no real reform was happening. So what Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky decide to do is recruit more men into their Red Guard and get some more officers in that Red Guard and hold another revolution, but a violent revolution at that, and they're going to have this thing known as the October Revolution. Now, ironically enough, the October Revolution happens in November, but here's an image from the October Revolution. The October Revolution is going to happen, and a very all-important new figure is going to pop up as well. This guy, okay? So this is the third dude that you need to know from the entire Russian revolutionary process. So looking at this right here, here's a picture of the October Revolution, of course, that happened in November. Why can't you just be on the same calendar, Russia? You got to get it together. Now, looking at this thing, though, that right there is Vladimir Lenin. Leon Trotsky, his Red Guard leader, is right there. But one of his very important other assistants, Lenin's very other important assistants, is this guy right here. That's Joseph Stalin, all right? Joseph Stalin was a socialist newspaper writer. He is going to actually help effectively lead the violent uprising of the October Manifesto, and he's going to get very, very close with Vladimir Lenin, and he's going to become one of his other second-in-commands, right? Now, Joseph Stalin is going to come up much more important when we get to World War II, but just keep in mind in the long run that Joseph Stalin is there, and he is going to begin to disagree with Trotsky on the way to take things forward and stuff like that. Now, Lenin and Trotsky, though, are going to lead the Red Army on a campaign to seize government buildings and infrastructure sites and take over all this different stuff. Now, the thing that's going to end up happening, though, they're going to show up in the streets with guns and weapons, and they're going to go in there and they're going to demand that they dismantle the provisional government. And that does happen. They go in and they rip down the provisional government. They overthrow them completely. They run Kerensky out, and they're just like, this is what we're going to do. We're going to elect a brand new legislative body, and we're going to call it the Constituent Assembly. So they have elections to elect this new Constituent Assembly, and Vladimir Lenin's sitting there kicked back like, we just had the October Revolution, and we just had a violent overthrow. We killed the people that didn't like us. We took over infrastructure sites, and we're leading Russia right now. There's no way people are going to... Wait, what do you mean that people didn't vote for us? That's right, when they had these elections for this new legislative body, the Bolsheviks and Lenin's party came in one of the minorities, right? There were 40% of the people that were voted for were labor democratic reformers, and then the Bolsheviks only got 27% of the vote or something really embarrassing. So what do you think Vladimir Lenin is going to do in response to when people don't vote for him? He's going to overthrow that brand new body, right? So he literally comes in and he overthrows the Constituent Assembly. So basically the October Revolution has two overthrows, the overthrow of the provisional government and the overthrow of the Constituent Assembly within a very short amount of time. So Lenin and the Bolsheviks, though, begin to create a brand new government, and they basically take over in a very coup-like fashion. They take over and they decide to execute anyone who advocates for democratic reform, and they try to basically bring in a campaign of land, peace, and bread, right? Land, peace, bread. Now, bread is related to labor reform, okay? Peace, land, bread has always been Lenin's dichotomy or idea. Now he's calling it, peace, land, equality, but we're going to get to that whole thing in here in a minute. But to appease the masses the moment he overthrows this brand new legislative body and stuff like that, he leads a couple of very important things. Land reform is a very big one. He illegalizes private property. He collectivizes agricultural land. And a big thing that happens is he begins a campaign of executing these people known as kulaks, right? And we'll talk more about the kulaks again later on when we get into close to World War II and kind of the interwar years and stuff like that. But kulaks are middle-class farmers that actually owned land in places like the Ukraine and in other areas of Russia as well. But basically, he starts a campaign of just executing these people, being like, oh, those were the ones that held all the land and goods away from the people and all this other crazy stuff. Now, labor reform is going to be another one. He's going to set a minimum wage. But the key one that's very, very important is the concept of peace. The moment that Lenin comes into office, he believes and truly wants to sell the fact that they needed to get out of World War I. So he introduces peace talks with the Germans. He was like, we have no business fighting you. We have no business fighting any man. We need to focus on the socialism in our country and the uprisings that are happening there, so we don't want to be involved in World War I anymore. So the moment that actually he overthrows the government, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is going to be proposed by the Germans. Now, really, really quickly, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk is a very draconian, very screwed up document that basically embarrassed Russia and took a huge swath of their land away. But the thing about it is that Lenin was like, it's okay, I think I'm going to get that land back anyway when socialist uprisings start in other countries because we have now set the example. And by this point, Lenin's not calling himself socialist anymore, he's calling himself communist, right? He is saying that we are the communist government of Russia. He declares peace with the Germans. Russia is going to lose the war technically, give up a third of its most populated land holdings, and be pretty embarrassed in this long run. But like I said, Lenin thought that he was going to get this and this back from Austria, Hungary, and Germany because they had set the example of having a communist revolution. So they believed that everybody was going to have one and that everybody was just going to end up giving it back to Russia no matter what. So he takes that entire treaty, goes forward, and the capital is going to be moved from Petrograd and it's going to be moved over to Moscow, right? And now a big thing that's going to go on, though, is instead of trying to directly inspire those revolutions in other countries, he focuses on the socialism in his country. Now, the thing that does end up going down, though, is that he focuses on all these things. But something that you need to understand that's going to drive some people insane. So this area right there and extending into this territory right here is a region known as Czechoslovakia, right? So at this point, the Czechoslovakians wanted their own independence. And they fought on the side of the Russians in World War I, thinking that once they won and once they were victorious, that they would get their own country known as Czechoslovakia. And Slovakia, of course, having a very large Slavic population, was demanding their own independence. Well, when Russia backs out and signs this treaty and is basically nope, we're done, and then leaves and gives up all this land to the Germans and the Austrians, the Czechoslovakians feel extremely betrayed, right? And so they start forming a paramilitary group and a militia, and they want to go into Russia and start another fight. So what ends up happening is the Russian Civil War breaks out, right? So going on in Russia at this point is not everybody is on board with Lenin's ideas, right? A lot of people are super against Lenin's ideas, and the thing that breaks out is a very large-scale war that lasts all the way up until 1922, where the Reds, led by Lenin, Stalin, and Trotsky, are going to go up against the Whites, which are the old Russian army officers, monarchists, the Czechoslovakian Legion, and several other groups that maybe don't necessarily want Nicholas II back in power, but they really, really, really want to get rid of Lenin, right? Now, the thing about it is when the whole war starts, when the Civil War starts, the Whites are super successful early on. They take over everything in Siberia and all this stuff, but the thing about it is they never take St. Petersburg or Moscow, which are the most infrastructure dependent and most industrialized areas of Russia, right? So the Reds are going to prevail with a more organized and very strict military. The Whites are very scattered all over the place. Apparently one officer has a very hard time keeping his officers sober. The Whites were uncoordinated in their outskirts attacks. The violent, and also the other big thing is inside of all these cities, Lenin introduces this thing known as the Red Terror, right? Kind of the Reign of Terror. He starts executing people in mass that may or may not try to side with the Whites and stuff like that. And the Whites also couldn't decide between liberalism or a monarchist government. So the other big thing too is the United States, France, and several of the Allies supported the Whites, and it still didn't help them out. And then in the long run, one big thing that the whites always wanted to do was save or get a hold of these people, right? Remember, the royal family has been under arrest since the beginning of the Russian Revolution, right? Once he abdicated the throne, they went under arrest. They were being held by the provisional government. But once the October Revolution happens and Lenin and Trotsky and Stalin overthrow the provisional government and run Kerensky out, the Reds then take possession of the royal family, and they start moving them through different safe houses. This is a colorized picture of the royal family, which is really interesting. They start moving them through different safe houses, trying to keep them away from the White Army, right? Now, the thing about it is, at one point, they end up in a small city on the outskirts towards Siberia, outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg. That city, while they were being actually held onto, they were being held in a safe house where they had covered the glass with newspapers and all this other crazy stuff. And Alexandria, the Tsarina right here, was telling the girls to take their jewels and sew them into the seams of their pillowcases and hide them in their dresses and stuff like that. But then one day, out of nowhere, what ends up happening is, right after this picture was taken, about a day after this picture was taken, the royal family was told to come out and that they were going to be being moved again. And then the thing that ends up happening is they take them into a basement, and the Reds decide, rather than having them fall into the hands of the whites, who are basically knocking on their doorstep, what they're going to decide to do instead is they shoot all of them. And so a day after this picture was taken, or some people say the day this picture was taken, this entire family was shot, right? Now, the very famous figure is Anastasia right there, and we'll talk about her a little bit in class and stuff like that, but they were all shot by the Red Army, right? And executed by the Red Army. But the crazy thing about it is, in the long run, only one of them was truly shot, quote unquote, and it was Nicholas. All the soldiers that came in, they brought in 7 soldiers to shoot the 7 people of the royal family. But what ended up happening is the 7 soldiers were each told to be you're going to shoot Anastasia, and you're going to shoot Alexandria, and you're going to shoot Nicholas, and you're going to shoot Alexei, right? All those 7 soldiers got excited, and they all shot Nicholas because they wanted to be the one that shot Nicholas. And then since they had ran out of bullets, they then went up and bayoneted and stabbed the children and the wife to death, which is insane. But this, as you can see, that execution story during the Russian Civil War just kind of demonstrates some of the extreme violence. This right here is a propaganda poster from the Russian Civil War, and it shows a white knight coming in to prevail over the red dragon, right? And actually reestablish the kingdom of Russia. But the thing about it is in the long run, the Reds are going to pretty much emerge victorious by 1920, but the Russian Civil War doesn't truly stop until 1922. And after 1922, Russia is not even going to be called Russia anymore. It's going to be called the USSR, due to the fact that as of 1922, what's going to happen is World War I's over, right? So we have to jump backwards here in 2 seconds, okay? Now, but what's going to happen is the Reds end up defeating an allied force of Americans who had actually just recently entered the war, which helped the whites and all these other people. But yeah, so as you can tell, Russia's pretty insane, and Lenin is in charge, right? And the other big thing too is Lenin is in charge, and he's ruling with this Greka, right? Which he uses to actually go out and execute anybody who doesn't agree with him. What we got to do is we got to kind of leave all that Russia stuff behind, and we will come back to it in the next unit and stuff like that, and we'll heavily review that stuff in class whenever we get back on whatever day, Friday. Yeah, so but now we need to actually kind of wrap up World War I. So we have to jump backwards in time. We have to go all the way back to the Western Front and what's going on, because as you know already, whenever the 1917 Russian Revolution Phase 1 starts with the February Revolution and things like that, basically in the long run, Russia is basically a non-factor in this war anymore, right? So meanwhile, back on the Western Front, though, from the years of about 1916, 1917, going into 1918 and things like that, the morale of this war is very, very low, right? They are basically still locked in a stalemate. They're trying to throw these different weapons at each other. They're trying to turn the tide of the war, and this is the result, right? That right there is a picture from the very famous battle known as Passchendaele, when so many troops drown in ponds of mud, right? And the thing about it is, though, is as you can see, this is getting absolutely terrible. And the Germans want to try and turn the tide of this war aggressively and quickly. And also what's happening on the top of everything else is out of nowhere in 1917, as of February 1st, went right on the precipice of when the February Revolution starts in 1917, and now that Lenin is back in Russia, they decide to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. Yes, the thing that they had sworn off ever since 1915. They decide to bring back again. They decide to go back to using unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 and start trying to resume using it to try and destroy supplies going in and out of England. Now, why would they do this now? Well, the biggest thing about it is that Lenin is successfully back in Russia by this point, right? Lenin is now back in Russia. They have confidence that he is going to lead the Russians out of the war and things like that. So they're like, okay, now's our chance. Also, because there are food riots and aggressively low morale going on in Germany. This is a picture right here after a food riot that broke out in one of the streets of like a German city. And as you can see, it says feine Fleisch. All right, so feine Fleische and Wurstwacke, like which literally means fine meats and sausage makers, right? This is like a family butcher shop that's had the doors and the windows broken in, and people have gone in there to try and take anything that they can get their hands on, right? And you have like German soldiers there to try and prevent the food riots that are going on. But why are food riots going on in Germany? Because of the blockades, because of that fantastic Uber Eats and DoorDash thing that Morgan Godet said in class, which honestly is one of the funniest things I've ever heard in my entire existence teaching, right? The number one thing about it, though, is that the Germans are running out of food. Morale is very low, not even for just the military men, but morale is even low for these people right here. The citizens of Germany are beginning to demand an end to the war because rationing is ineffective in Germany. People are starving. The draft also in places like Germany are running out of soldiers. Germany, by this point of the war in 1917, was drafting soldiers as young as the age of 15. Right? And so the expectation was that Germany, once Russia drops out, is going to focus all their forces and try to knock France and the Allies out as quickly as possible. But then something crazy happened. One of the craziest, weirdest things occurred, and this note got sent, and it's known as the Zimmerman telegram. Do me a favor, highlight Zimmerman telegram. Make it look like it's exploding. Make it underline. It's very important. Jordan, I know, is probably making a flashcard already. Now, the Zimmerman note or the Zimmerman telegram is a very, very important moment. And it's a very, very big deal because of what's going to end up going on. The Zimmerman note is going to cause some controversy because there's a lot of like kind of stories about like, did the Germans ever write it? Did they ever say that? Or was it made up by the British? Because the British are the ones that intercepted it, and they're like, maybe the British actually wrote it to try and get America to join the war. But another big question too, was American involvement inevitable? Was it coming eventually no matter what? Were they just looking for a reason, right? But what the Zimmerman note is a very important thing because you need to know what it is and what it said. But what it is was a note or a telegram written by a man named Arthur Zimmerman, a German ambassador. And he wrote it to the German minister in Mexico in January 1st of 1917. And this note told the minister to Mexico, the German minister to Mexico, to convince the Mexican government to invade the United States if they ever decided to enter the war on the side of the Allies. This would force the United States military to stay and fight Mexico rather than going over to Europe and stopping any kind of major push that the Germans were trying to design, right? So this was decoded and then given to the U.S. on February 1st, 1917 by the British, right? The British apparently intercepted it and were actually very furious about the resuming of unrestricted submarine warfare, which a lot of people argue is the real reason why the U.S. got involved again, is because Woodrow Wilson said, don't do that unrestricted submarine warfare anymore, Germany, and then they're going to do it anyway, right? So this is going to be decoded, given to the Americans by the British. It's going to be published all over American newspapers in March as a way to encourage them to enroll in the military, and then U.S. is going to declare war on Germany in April of 1917. Now, the thing about it is, though, y'all, yes, they declare war on Germany in April of 1917. So yeah, the U.S. is going to declare war in April of 1917. But do you know how long it takes us to actually get fully mobilized? Mobilization takes quite some time for these doughboys to come on in, right? So just to give you a heads up, the name doughboy refers to American soldiers. European soldiers would oftentimes refer to American soldiers as doughboys. And we don't really know why. There's like no real like affirmed reason why this slang word ever popped up. But this right here were American soldiers that were actually sent and as a part of this thing known as the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, starts showing up in about June of 1917. But April, March, like June, like it's taking several months for the U.S. to get ready and get all the way over there. And most of the U.S. forces don't even show up really until October of 1917. But a really important thing that I think is very important to bring up as well, and I think it's super important to bring up because it's just like this is so much of a European history class in so many senses. And a lot of times all you see from World War I are pictures of soldiers that look like this, that are from America, that are going over there. But one of the famous and most successful fighting regiments from World War I was actually this group right here. These guys are an all-black division that actually was sent to like World War I and fought for the American forces, but they have the coolest name ever. And they joined up with the French military on the Western Front in June of 1917. They were one of the very first groups of Americans to go over there and fight in Europe to actually try and defend against the things that were going on and protect the people of like France. And they were known as the Harlem Hellfighters. And they're so dope. And their logo is sick. It's this like purple snake and stuff like that. But anyway, in the long run, we'll talk a little bit more about them in class. But here come the Doughboys and here come the Americans going into this war. But remember, it takes time to mobilize, right? So yes, we declare war in April of 1917, and we don't really show up until June of 1917, but our full forces don't get there until October of 1917. When you really think about it, that's taking so long. So the Germans decide to do an all-out offensive. They try to attack as fast as they possibly can and focus all of their efforts completely onto the Western Front, right? So in the spring of 1918, what's going to happen is that they try to head off American involvement, and the Germans strike hard and fast at the French-British lines with everything they've got, right? Everything they've got. So in the spring of 1918, they just come in full force to try and weaken the areas around the different Western front lines. So they're coming flying in with everything they've got. Weapons, like different kinds of, like, they tried their best to invent tanks. They're coming in with poisonous gas. They're even bringing in new forms of troops known as stormtroopers. Yes, the same kind of stormtroopers that you hear about like in like Star Wars and stuff are actually referring to German stormtroopers that were light infantry that would be able to like actually navigate no man's land in small groups and get into the trenches, fire off shots, and then get out of there, as in storming the other side. Tanks, new weapons, they're going to come within a very close distance of Paris. Look how close to Paris they got. Paris is literally located like right there, and that's how close the Germans actually got. But the thing is that they are going to get stalled out at the Second Battle of the Marne, and here come the Americans. The American forces, by the spring of 1918, are now in full force, and we have over 200,000 troops in Europe fighting and ready. And 140,000 of them get concentrated on the lines where the Germans are pushing their offensive. We slow them down, and the front then slowly starts getting pushed further and further and further back into Austria and Germany. But the biggest thing you need to understand in the long run, a lot of historians are now looking back at World War I and trying to figure out who really lost this war. Did the German military, did they lose the war, or did the German people decide that they had had enough? All right, so the German people, I think, as a historian, decided they had enough. As you can see right here, that is the scene in a German city. This is in this German city of Frankfurt, I believe. Now, this right here is men with rifles fighting against their own German government, hiding behind a barricade that they built out of newspaper, which is genius because actually, like, big things of newspaper are bulletproof. So now they are literally fighting against their government, who is telling them to ration their food even more, to try and skip meals, to try and get through this hunger riots and things like that are going on. And the Germans are freaking out, and revolution is ensuing. They're demanding that the Kaiser step down. And the other big thing you got to understand is, like, in the long run, they begin to turn on their monarchs, right? Germany and Austria-Hungary were still being led by monarchs, and they're beginning to look over at them and being like, we're starving in the streets and you're still eating. How does this work, right? And like, if a monarch's role is to take care of his people and he's not taking care of them, then what's the point, right? So the regular citizens of Germany begin to start fighting back against their own government. And on top of everything else, their own military starts to mutiny. This right here is known as the Kiel Mutiny, K-I-E-L Mutiny, which is actually a mutiny of sailors who refused to go out and fight against the British and would rather stay home. And they were like, basically were just like, I absolutely refuse to go out there, and I will not go out there, and I will not fight this war anymore. And so that's a good example that many of the parts of the German military are also giving up. And so under the advisement, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicates the throne, flees to the Netherlands. The Weimar Republic is going to be founded. Austria-Hungary is going to abolish its monarchy. And by November 9th and 10th, that's when all of that happens. By November 11th, the Central Powers surrender. And an armistice is going to be declared. And it's going to happen on 11/11/18. That's right, November the 11th, on the 11th day, the 11th month, the 11th hour, on a train car heading to Versailles in 1918, World War I is going to kind of come to an end, but an armistice is going to be called, right? So you have to understand, like, fighting still kind of continued in a lot of different areas, like all over Europe and stuff like that. But World War I was pretty much declared over in November 11th, 1918. Paramilitary groups were still roaming around. Some fighting was still going on in Africa and the Middle East and things like that. But aggressively and swiftly, the Allies are going to try and open up peace talks and get aggressively after trying to formalize peace going forward. Now, several different things are going to happen, but it takes time to get these peace accords ready. But by January of 1919, peace settlements that end the war between Germany and the Allied powers are going to get drawn up. Now, the original thing that Woodrow Wilson wants to do, the original proposal, was the idea of the 14 points. Woodrow Wilson, who was in failing health and really struggling like mentally and things like that, goes into these peace talks trying to actually form peace. Not trying to punish anybody, not trying to attack any of the other groups, not trying to be like, it's your fault that this all happened. They decide, he goes in and he's like, we have 14 points coming from America that we think if we follow these 14 points, then we will be able to avoid a future war. The 14 points included a lot of very smart things. Open diplomacy, no like free trade over the waters, outlawing of unrestricted submarine warfare, reducing the amount of armaments, establishing a very smart idea of the League of Nations, which was literally Woodrow Wilson's baby. The idea of creating a League of Nations to come together and discuss and talk about peace settlements to avoid future war, to come together and let these things happen, okay? And that was his baby, his pet project. He wanted it so badly. And national self-determination, right? They wanted the idea, or Woodrow Wilson wanted to allow these people who wanted to be their own countries to be allowed to live free from outside interference, right? Take down the empires, give the Czechoslovakians their own country, give the Slavics their Yugoslavia, give all these people the countries that they deserve. No more empires, no more Ottomans, no more nobody, right? And he decides he wants to do all these things, and it's going to lead to the rise at this conference of the Big Three, right? The Big Three in the conversation are going to be these gentlemen right here. Woodrow Wilson's right there. He's our 14 points guy. George Clemenceau is right there, and that's David Lloyd George, right? And David Lloyd George is going to be the Prime Minister of Great Britain at the time. They are the Big Three heads of state. Wilson is obsessed with peace and the League of Nations. But George and Clemenceau, who represent Great Britain and France, are dedicated to punishing Germany because they feel that it's their fault. They feel that it's their fault. They were like, no, their 14 points, Woodrow Wilson, is not good enough. It's not hard enough. It is not mean enough. We want to punish Germany. So Clemenceau begins to throw out demands, and he's the French president, so I do understand why he's doing this, because France shared so much property destruction and destroyed crops and famine as well, and the deaths of their soldiers, all because Germany attacked them, right? So Clemenceau demands demilitarization of Germany. Completely. As in, they're not allowed to have an army of over 100,000, and they can't have an air force or a navy ever again. Clemenceau also demands that Germany pay reparations for the entire war, and that also a buffer state be created between France and Germany, known as the Rhineland, right? And we'll talk about the Rhineland again when we get into our next thing as well. This agreement, though, what's going to happen, though, here is the merging of the two things. That merging was known as the Treaty of Versailles, right? The agreement, this Treaty of Versailles, these right here, he said was its creation of League of Nations, comma. This should be bullet points, right? I was just trying to save some room. So the agreement in the Treaty of Versailles is going to be the creation of the League of Nations. Even though, ironically enough, America never joins it. The thing that Wilson wanted so badly, America never even joins. Also, we never ratified this treaty as well. We never once ratified the Treaty of Versailles. The agreement in the Treaty of Versailles also is take Germany's military away, chops up Europe in the Treaty of Saint Germain or whatever, and takes away all of the empires, gives away all the land of like Austria-Hungary, gives away most parts of the Ottoman and stuff like that. Reparations for Germany. Germany is going to have to pay $2.7 trillion in war reparations, right? Which is a huge amount. Germany's going to have to give up all of its colonies and give all of them over to the other big three nations. The Rhineland would be established. Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman are going to be dismantled. And Wilson is basically going to be defeated. And the map of Europe goes from looking like this to looking like this, right? And so in the long run, all these things are going to be established. But on top of everything else, the most embarrassing thing that happened was this thing known as the War Guilt Clause, where Germany was forced in the Treaty of Versailles to sign a clause taking responsibility for the war completely, and that they would pay all reparations and civilian damages. But we will talk more about this in class and how screwed up this was, but I'll see y'all then. Y'all have a good one.